On January 13, 1945, a United States Navy PB-4Y Liberator flying at 8,000 feet over Brunei Bay was jumped by Japanese fighters. The plane's nose gunner took bullets in the legs. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Marvin Smith, put the crippled Liberator down in a muddy rice paddy near the coast. The nose gunner died in the rubber raft as his crewmates dragged him from the wreckage. 9 men stepped out alive into a jungle that offered no maps and no promise of rescue. 11 days later and 100 miles inland, District Officer William Makahanap returned to the village of Long Barang. He had just finished a bloody campaign that killed every Japanese soldier in the Mentarang district. Now he stood on the riverbank and watched 4 American Army airmen approach his house. They were thin, ragged, and alive. Makahanap knew that his war against the Japanese was only beginning, but he also carried a blood chit from Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands promising reward for aiding downed Allied personnel. He would not need the promise. The choice to resist had already been made. On 25th of March, Kelabit men returning from their fields on the high plain of Ba stopped cold. 2 clusters of figures were drifting down through the clouds, suspended beneath enormous white canopies. The men ran to the Barrio longhouse and reported what they had seen. Some elders urged that these creatures from the sky be killed before they brought trouble, but Penghulu Lawai Bisara, the government-appointed chief who had once spent time in jail downriver under a white district officer, held a different view. He ordered a white flag rigged to a length of bamboo and sent young men out to wave it as a sign of peace. The first man to reach the longhouse was a slender Australian sergeant named Fred Sanderson, who spoke Malay. Behind him came a tall Englishman with pale eyes who moved through the longhouse as if he had been there before. He had 12 years earlier. Major Tom Harrison had spent his 21st birthday in these same highlands as the leader of an Oxford University expedition. Now he commanded Seamute 1, a team of 8 Allied special operatives dropped from Australian liberators to gather intelligence and organize resistance ahead of the planned June invasion of Brunei Bay. His radio operators wrestled with a damaged Boston wireless transmitter receiver, the team's only link to headquarters. The Kelabit quickly decided this was a man who already knew them, and they welcomed him with borak, a local rice beer, and song. Within days, Harrison heard from Kelabit in contact with their Loon Dayak cousins across the border that American fugitives were being hidden in Dutch Borneo. On April 3rd, District Officer William Makahanap left the hidden valley of Punan Silao carrying a letter from Lieutenant Philip Corin addressed to any Allied forces who might be in the area. Makahanap pushed hard through the mountains and reached Belawit in 3 days instead of 5. There he found Harrison, who had just arrived from Barrio. The major read Corin's letter with keen interest. It told of 7 Army airmen shot down in November and 2 Navy survivors from a January crash, all hidden and fed by the Loon Dayak, while Makahanap organized the killing of every Japanese patrol that came upriver. Harrison sat down that same evening and wrote his reply. He told Corin that rescue was now possible and that planes could drop supplies on the Bawang Plain, which his team had identified as a potential landing zone. He promised to signal the airmen's names and numbers to headquarters so their families would know they were alive. He wrapped up the letter with news from the outside world. American forces had taken Iwo Jima, the Russians were nearing Berlin, and Roosevelt was still alive. Makahanap left before dawn the next morning with the letter, several submachine guns, and a handful of pistols for the airmen. When he reached Punan Silao and handed the envelope to Corin, the Americans laughed and wept at the same time. Help had finally arrived. From Punan Silao, Philip Corin, Daniel Illerick, and a gaunt red-headed sergeant named Thomas Capin set out west toward the border mountains on April 10th. 2 of their crewmates stayed behind, one too ill with malaria to travel. The 3 airmen walked barefoot through days of rain, stopping each night at a longhouse village. On the 14th, they crossed into Sarawak and reached the edge of the Bawang Plain with its wet rice paddies. 4 days later, on the 18th, they arrived at Belawit. Major Tom Harrison met them in Belawit with chocolate, cigarettes, and a bottle of scotch. Over their first real news in 5 months, they learned that Roosevelt was dead and the Russians were nearing Berlin. Harrison had already signaled their names and serial numbers to headquarters, so their families would know they were alive. A medic dosed the worst of their scabies with penicillin. Harrison then assigned each man a role. Corin would train a Dayak platoon, Ilaric would repair the damaged Boston wireless set above the village, and Cappan was sent to assist a field medic at Pa Dali. On the 7th of May, Australian Warrant Officer Rod Cusack began turning Makahanap's Dayak irregulars into a trained guerrilla force. Cusack was a tall, burly veteran from Brisbane who moved through the longhouses with a cheerful confidence that put the native fighters at ease. His men received carbines and grenades alongside their traditional blowpipes and machetes. In a week, the first platoons were ready to patrol the river approaches to Long Barang and keep watch for Japanese troop movements. At the same time, construction of a real airstrip at Bellewaet got underway under the supervision of Trooper Bob Griffiths. The Lun Daye Paramount Chief Lasong Piri donated a stretch of unused rice paddy for the strip and called for volunteers. More than 1,000 men, women, and children came from surrounding villages to clear the ground, split bamboo, and weave the strips into a landing deck 100 yards long. When finished, the runway could be flooded by breaching the paddy bank, making it look from the air like an ordinary field. On the morning of June the 7th, 2 Australian Auster aircraft appeared over the Bawang Plain. Flight Lieutenant Fred Cheney and Flight Officer Johnny White had volunteered to fly the unarmed planes deep into enemy territory. Below them lay the bamboo airstrip at Bellewaet, 100 yards of split bamboo laid across a drained rice paddy. White came in first from the west, his wheels catching the decking perfectly. Cheney followed, but halfway down the strip he saw he would ram the parked Auster. He wrenched the stick hard to the left, and his plane lurched off the bamboo into the soft mud. The wheels sank deep. The Auster nosed over onto its back, the fuselage cracking open like an eggshell. Cheney and his passenger, Major Tom Harrison, climbed out unhurt. The plane looked like a complete write-off, but Cheney was not ready to give up. The Dayak villagers who had built the strip crowded around, and Cheney began to work out how to repair the wreck with the only materials at hand, bamboo strips and fabric dope. That same afternoon, a Catalina flying boat appeared overhead. Flight Lieutenant Gordon Reed had come to drop supplies. Among the bundles tumbling down under parachutes was one small object that caught the light. The villagers brought it to Cheney, a silver flask full of whiskey with a note attached. A friend on Tarakan had written that it was his most prized possession and that he would not have dropped it if he did not believe Cheney would get out alive. Cheney kept the flask as a talisman, while the Dayaks bound his shattered fuselage with bamboo strips, working through the heat until the plane was airworthy again. 3 days later, on June the 10th, the bamboo strip had been lengthened to 250 yards. A stretcher was brought to the airstrip carrying Seaman First Class Alvin Harms, a Navy navigator from the PB-4Y that had crashed near Brunei Bay in January. Harms could not walk. Infected leech bites had swollen both feet to twice their normal size, and months of malaria had left him too weak to stand. Cheney helped load the litter into the repaired Auster, then climbed into the cockpit and opened the throttle. The plane lurched forward along the bamboo decking. For a terrible moment it seemed the wheels would not clear the end of the strip, but the Auster staggered into the air just before the deep mud at the far edge. The repaired fuselage began to shudder violently. Cheney throttled back, and the vibration eased. He held the plane low and slow, nursing it over the mountains of the Crocker Range. Hours later, the outline of Tarakan Island appeared ahead, and Cheney set the Auster down on the runway. As the wheels touched, the bamboo-repaired fuselage broke in two. Both men stepped out unharmed. Alvin Harms was the first downed airman to leave Borneo. He was carried to a Navy hospital on Morotai that same day, bound for his home in Holly, Colorado. At Bellewaet, the remaining Americans watched the sky and waited their turn. The bamboo airstrip had proven itself, the evacuation had begun. On the morning of June the 15th, the weather over the Bawang Plain broke. Fred Cheney's repaired Auster appeared above the bamboo strip at Bellewaet, and this time the landing held. Sergeant Thomas Cappan walked out from the aid station at Pa Dali, still barefoot, still thin, but standing on his own feet, he climbed into the Auster without a word. The engine revved, the wheels lifted from the split bamboo, and the little plane banked west toward the coast. Cappan was the first of the Army airmen to leave since Alvin Harms had gone out 5 days earlier. He did not look back. Over the following week, the evacuation became a steady rhythm, one Auster flight each day, weather permitting. On June the 17th, Corporal James Knock, one of the 4 Army airmen who had first reached Makahanap's house back in November, was carried to the airstrip from Punan Salau, still shaking with malaria, too weak to chew solid food. A Dayak woman had chewed his meals for him the night before and fed him from her own hand. The Auster took him to Labuan Island, then to Morotai, then to a transport plane bound for Guam. When he landed at Travis Air Force Base in California, he was 80 pounds lighter than the day he had shipped out. His parents had moved away too, heartsick to stay in the house where they had last seen their son. After the war, Knock recovered from malaria, married his girlfriend Maggie, and became a successful farmer in California, inventing new brooding methods for chickens that are now standard practice. He lived quietly on his ranch until his death from cancer in 2003. By June the 23rd, Lieutenant Philip Corrin and Sergeant Francis Harrington, who had been hiding in the Long Nuet village since shortly after the crash, were airborne together. Both flew out on 2 Austers that landed at WWII that morning. Corrin wore Australian shorts and a shirt he had been given on Labuan. He later wrote that the sight of the Golden Gate Bridge from the window of a C-54 transport was the most beautiful thing he would ever see. Eddie Haviland left the next day along with Seaman Robbie Robbins, one of the 4 Navy survivors from the January crash. Haviland had been scheduled to command a firing squad for 3 captured collaborators the day before his flight, but his departure spared him the duty. His friend who took his place described the execution afterward. Automatic rifles held down until the bodies were cut to ribbons. On June the 27th, Corporal John Nelson climbed into an Auster at WWII. He had been separated from the main group for months and treated with arsenic for a tropical illness. The flight took him to Labuan Island, where he rejoined his crewmates at last. Lieutenant Robert Graham and Aviation Chief Machinist's mate James Shepard, the 2 Navy survivors who had joined the Army Airmen at Punan Salau, were flown out together on June the 28th. Graham had not tasted food without rice since January. On Labuan Island, the mess hall served them eggs and bread and coffee, and they ate until their stomachs protested. Graham returned to his wife Janet, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for saving his crewmates, and became a sales representative and avid tennis player. The next day, June the 29th, Corporal Daniel Illerick said goodbye to Warrant Officer Bob Long at the radio shack above Pa, Maine. Illerick had been the last Yank still working the Boston Wireless, sending and receiving signals for Simute 1 since April. Major Harrison had written to headquarters that Illerick was their pet American and that he dreaded the day he would be evacuated. Illerick climbed into Cheney's Auster and gave the Australian flight lieutenant his broken Elgin wristwatch as a parting gift. He was the 11th and last downed airman to leave Borneo. The war in Borneo did not end with the evacuation. Thousands of Japanese troops had retreated inland from the coast, and a renegade column known as the Fujinotai pushed deeper into the highlands, stripping every village of food and livestock as it moved. Major Harrison, who had refused orders to pull his operatives out, pursued the column with a mixed force of Dayak and Australian fighters. On October the 28th, 1945, more than 2 months after the atomic bombs had fallen and the Emperor had surrendered, Harrison met the commander of the Fujinotai on a trail near the Bawang Plain. Captain Tai handed over his samurai sword. 340 Japanese soldiers laid down their arms and were taken prisoner. Warrant Officer Rod Cusack survived the campaign and returned to Australia after the war. The war in Borneo was finished. William Makahanap returned to Long Barang after the surrender. He had led his Dayak irregulars through months of guerrilla fighting, and the airstrip at WWII was now quiet. The bloodshed he had received from the Dutch government, promising a reward for aiding Allied personnel, turned out to be worth very little. In 1950, the United States Embassy in Jakarta gave him 29,000 rupiahs. It was the first and last payment he received. He tried to immigrate to the United States with his family, but the immigration authorities demanded proof that he could support himself without working. The sum required was 150,000 rupiahs. He could not raise it. He died in Java in 1984, having never returned to the country whose airmen he had saved. Panger and Ligon's sons kept the bombardier wings that Lieutenant Philip Corin had pinned to their father's hat before he went off to kill Japanese. After Ligon died, the wings were buried with him. Years later, when the Indonesian government recognized Ligon's wartime service, the sons unearthed the wings and brought them to a ceremony in Jakarta. Thomas Capon became an ordained Methodist minister in Nebraska and later a licensed psychotherapist. In his counseling work, he drew on what the Lun Daya had taught him about kindness, patience, and the value of shared food and shelter. He spoke of them for the rest of his life. What remains of those events is not a monument or a museum. It is the memory of 11 young men who dropped out of the sky into a world they did not understand. They were fed, clothed, hidden, and carried to safety by people whose language they could not speak and whose names they did not know. The Lun Daya asked nothing in return for what they gave. They simply saw strangers in need and they helped. If you have any personal stories from this era, any family memories of the Pacific War or the Borneo campaign, we would welcome hearing them in the comments below. Please consider subscribing to this channel and giving this video a like to support more documentaries like this one. Thank you for listening.